welcome to my back garden on this gloriously sunny day. This is the first of a series of Bible studies where we're going to be looking at the Bible itself and how it came to be put together. I hope you find it interesting, but before we can really get going, I need to ask you just a bit about your own history. How do you know about your family history? When we come to look at our family histories, well, there are lots of questions. I mean, how can you know your family history? How far back can you go? How does your family cope with the embarrassing people, the skeletons in your cupboard? What about the old records or letters or birth, marriage and death certificates? And what about those extraordinary photos with, or frustratingly without, names on the back? You can visit the gravestones, of course. And I suppose you need to know who the key people were that you could talk to, the key people who could tell you stuff. Always concerned, of course, to make sure that their memories are not faulty. So how do we know about Jesus? If you'd been there at the time, well, the different ways that you could have found out. The ordinary people in the crowds who heard this extraordinary preacher. Or maybe if you'd been one of the selected disciples, you'd have known about Jesus more intimately. And if you'd been one of the religious leaders, maybe you would then have had a very different view about getting to know Jesus. And what about the Roman authorities and their soldiers? They too would have had a particular view. But you can't talk to them because they're not here. So how do you know about Jesus? Well, the next thing in the history is to realise that after the death and resurrection of Jesus, after his ascension into heaven, we understand that his disciples went around, starting off at Jerusalem, but going further afield, telling people about Jesus. If you'd been around at that time, maybe you'd have heard them. You'd have seen these visiting disciples enthusing about Jesus of Nazareth. Or, after they'd been visiting, you may have started going to the places where they had set up groups of people to worship together. Things that we call church nowadays. And in these churches, perhaps you began to hear letters that were read out aloud by the people who'd set up the churches. That after they'd gone, they still wrote back, they still kept in touch to help explain this new faith, to correct any misunderstandings. Sometimes the letters would have been telling people off because they'd got things wrong about their faith. Indeed, one of the reasons that we've got an account of how the Lord's Supper, the breaking bread and sharing wine, should be practiced. The difficulty was that the church in Corinth was doing it wrongly, and Paul gets very cross when he explains how they should be doing it. And that's the account that we normally hear at communion services in every church today. And that was the first part of the New Testament. The letters written by people who knew Jesus or were close to those who had known Jesus. Peter, James and John, for example. And Paul, who had got to know Jesus through his friends much later on, after having persecuted the Christians, had had that experience on the road to Damascus. And he set up churches too. In fact, was one of the most prolific. And he wrote an awful lot of letters in the New Testament. And so the letters were written, but we know that there was the expectation that Jesus would be returning. In fact, they expected an imminent return. You know that many believers sold up everything, dedicated themselves to the idea that Jesus would be back very soon, perhaps at an unexpected time, like a thief in the night. But he hadn't come. and the generation who had met him was starting to die. Several early Christians thought a history needed to be written down. Although there was a good oral tradition, there were storytellers with good memories who could keep a story alive, often over more than one generation. Now there was a desire to do more than just tell the story. They needed to explain why Jesus mattered. They needed to create a coherent account. Simple, we say. So how do we know about Jesus? Well, the Gospel writers. Yeah, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. No, it's not that simple either. I mean, there were other Gospel writers too. There was the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, there's even the Gospel of Judas Iscariot. So how did we get these Gospels? The letters were written, but the Gospels came along. More about that next time.